Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia, where we're with the Aerospace Corporation to talk to Ted Muelhaupt, who is the director of the Center for Orbital and Reentry Debris Studies, or CORDS, which I think is very, very cool. Ted, thanks very much for joining us. You've been in this business for decades. You started with the Space Shuttle program at Rockwell, but you spent the last 38 years at the Aerospace Corporation. And we're here today. You guys did a great briefing to talk about China's space station, the Heavenly Palace, the Tiangong-1, which is going to re-enter here, and the big guessing game is where it ends up. So tell us a little bit about the Heavenly Palace that soon will be neither heavenly nor really palatial.
Well, welcome to Aerospace. We've been tracking the Tiangong-1 now for a couple of years since they lost control. The Chinese launched this about 5 years ago, I believe. And they conducted a couple of missions to, it was their first space station, their prototype. They sent taikonauts, their term for astronauts, to the station on 2 occasions, including the first female taikonaut. And after learning what they wished, its mission was ended. It was only planned for a 2-year mission. For the last couple of years, it has been in a decaying orbit, and we expect it to re-enter very soon now. It'll be an uncontrolled reentry, we believe, and it's interesting because there aren't that many space stations that have come back down.
Yes, and spacecraft coming down is always, everybody always thinks of the 1979 reentry of Skylab, which was a gigantic space station. This one is about 9 tons, if I understand correctly.
That's correct. It's 8,500 kilograms. It is a medium-sized object. It's neither among the biggest nor the smallest. It's about number 300 on our list of uncontrolled reentries. But it's good size, and there aren't that many manned objects that have re-entered, and it has a connection to a major movie, so that's one of the reasons for the interest in it.
That's right, and Gravity would be the movie. There's this tendency of thinking that anytime you shoot something into orbit, it's going to stay up there, whether it's Ed White's glove or shrouds from the Apollo program, or even more recent satellites. Once you get over that 17,500 mile an hour hill and you cannonball something up there, that it'll generally stay up there. But what are the factors that actually causes something to come back home?
Well, it depends on the orbit you start in and the altitude. The atmosphere doesn't really stop. It just gets thinner and thinner. And once you're above about 200 kilometers, it's effectively a vacuum, but not quite. As you go higher, it still gets thinner and thinner still. Once you're above about 600 kilometers, your orbit will last typically 25 years or more before the drag will bring it down. And if you're up around 2,000 kilometers, it's hundreds of years. Higher than that, where the GPS is, geosynchronous satellites, they may never come down depending on the orbit. But when you're in a low orbit, and manned objects typically stay below about 400 kilometers, and one of the reasons is that there's enough drag that the space debris cleans out. So that drag is there, and if they don't actively reboost, they will come in, usually within a matter of several years. Typically, if you're around 300 kilometers, you've got maybe a year to go. Tiangong-1 is now down close to that 200 mark, so we expect it to come in soon.
And is it in an elliptical orbit, a circular orbit? What sort of orbit is it? Because that, of course, brings it into denser atmosphere. I mean, even though it's not very dense, but it's significantly denser, that creates drag and is what helps things come home.
Well, few orbits are perfectly circular. Tiangong is reasonably circular. I think there's about a 10-kilometer difference between apogee and perigee, the highest and lowest points in the orbit. And as it slows down, its orbit will tend to get more circular. Generally, objects that are in orbit, the drag affects them reasonably evenly, and it tends to smooth out the orbit toward the end. But this one is in a approximately circular orbit at about 43 degrees inclination, which takes it north and south on any given orbit between, well, really the southern part of Asia up to not quite the Canadian border, more or less Wisconsin, that level, most also over the heart of Europe.
Your chart, and we will put some of the graphics up so that folks can see that you guys have been tracking this for a while. So there isn't anything that humankind won't bet on, and space scientists are no different. So what's your betting pool? You know, what's the time slot you stake your claim to?
We have, on any given prediction, we have about a 20% error on the time to go, which means that it could be the other side of the planet even a few hours before. But in terms of where it'll land, it's probably going to land in the ocean. 3/4 of the Earth is covered by water, so you're most likely to land in the ocean. And when you look at the map of what it covers, you're also over the Amazon, you're over the Gobi Desert, you're over the Australia, the Sahara. So lots of that of the places it could land are uninhabited. So most likely it'll land someplace people aren't, and we may not get a good look at it.
But you don't yet. If you were betting, you haven't staked out sort of April 1 at 10:25 a.m. or anything.
Well, as of this morning, we were saying 6:45, or no, we updated it 4 o'clock in the morning, Universal Time, on April the 1st. We think there's about a day plus or minus as of today's prediction. As we get closer, that window will narrow, but right now the center of it is April Fool's Day.
Yeah, and it's a great way to celebrate the Royal Air Force's centenary as the world's oldest Air Force. So I'm sure everybody in London is going to be happy about that. Talk to us a little bit about what survives reentry and what does not survive reentry, because there's this perception that it's actually the biggest and heaviest things on a spacecraft that survive, whereas it's actually the direct opposite. Talk to us about how the whole process works and what ends up surviving and what doesn't.
Well, unless you design a spacecraft for reentry, it's going to come apart, is the general rule. Now, Tiangong-1 consists of a couple of cylinders, the solar arrays, antennas. What'll happen is that it starts to heat. The lightest, biggest objects will break off first. The solar arrays will probably fail first, and they'll re-enter separately. As it gets deeper into the atmosphere, the vehicle will heat up. As the heating starts to build, the pressures start to build, the vessel will come apart. What happens is that the individual parts then re-enter separately, and it really depends on what they're made of and how fast they slow down. The lighter pieces slow down faster, and so they experience less time getting that high heating. And so they tend to actually survive better if they have what's known as a low ballistic coefficient, because they simply spend less time in the heating portion of the reentry. Heavier, denser objects may last longer. They'll experience more heating, and that means there's more burning. But if the object is big enough and heavy enough, it's got enough mass to get all the way through that portion. And so what you tend to get are either lightweight objects or some of the densest, heaviest objects are the two pieces most likely to survive reentry. So you might get, for example, in a rocket engine, the core pump of the engine might survive, but the bell probably won't. The thing we find most often are big empty tanks, because they slow down fast, and because they're empty, they're relatively lightweight. So that's what we tend to find when we find space debris.
Well, relatively so, right? Because some of them can be 500 pounds or more in weight. So so everybody's always wonders, could I get hit with this? Is it going to go over a major population center? What's the risk of getting hit? Because you guys, I think, put it sort of as a trillion. That you have a better chance of winning, like sort of a big lottery than actually getting hit by something. But how much evidence do we have of stuff being destroyed, even by 500-pound objects that are coming in?
It's been very, very rare. There are cases where we've seen, some damage. There was a case where a pecan tree and a chicken coop were knocked down by a tank. We think there was a tank that damaged a van in Milwaukee, but we weren't able to get the tank recovered, so we can't confirm that. The
police destroyed it, apparently.
The police destroyed it. There was an Impala in, I think, New Jersey that had a hole punched in its trunk. But only one person's ever been hit by a piece of space debris that we know of, and she was just fine. It was a very lightweight piece of insulation that hit her. But the objects can be very big, and so when we calculate the odds, we look at what's the area of the surviving debris divided by the area it'll hit, divided by the number of people and the area of a person, and when you calculate all that together, it ends up being extremely low odds. I'd worry way more about crossing the street than about space debris.
And it was Lottie Williams of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think you put her name up.
She was walking out in the open. A piece of something brushed her shoulder. She picked it up. She couldn't figure out where it came from, gave it to a friend at the university, and we were able to correlate it with a reentry of a very large tank that landed only a few hundred yards from a farmer's house in Texas. So the debris spreads over an extremely large area, and it's the smaller and lighter it is, the earlier in the reentry it's going to come in. So objects follow the orbital path. The lightweight stuff comes in first, the heavier objects go further, and by the time they hit the ground, the reentry is done. They're just falling. So it's whatever the speed that something's going to fall. If it's a big heavy object, a few hundred miles an hour. If it's lightweight, maybe only tens of miles an hour.
As you put it, it's sort of a 15-pound bowling ball hitting you in the head from 9 inches.
That is the definition of injury to a person, is if you picked a bowling ball up off the table about 9 inches and dropped it, and you imagine that amount of energy, if that energy was delivered to you, we would define that mathematically as an injury to a person. But all these calculations are done on the basis of people standing in the open, unsheltered. And of course, in real life, they're probably indoors, watching television or something, and they're not just standing there in the open.
Unless, of course, a 500-pound tank comes through your roof, and that it's about 15 joules, right, of energy.
15 joules is the definition of injury to a person,
right?
And so it's not a very. You can imagine that if somebody dropped that bowling ball on your head, it would hurt, and so I think that's a reasonably good definition of injury. But of course, it depends on where it hits you. Miss Williams was brushed on the shoulder, and by something nowhere near that big. And she was not injured.
2 last quick questions. Number one, should there be better international safeguards for deorbiting stuff? I'll give you an example. When we visited Virgin Orbit, those folks out there, we talked to Dan Hart, and Sir Richard Branson himself has said, look, we've got to deorbit some of these things to keep space junk from building up. So we should reserve a little bit of fuel to precisely deorbit a booster, just like shrouds and other things should be deorbited as well. So that let's save some fuel, let's build some margin into our launch vehicles in order to do that. As more stuff goes into orbit, more stuff has a tendency of coming down. We're talking about many, many much smaller, lightweight constellations that people want to shoot into orbit. Should there be better regulations and laws that say, hey, if you put it up there, you've got to be responsible for somehow getting rid of it?
Well, I'll stop short of laws and say, well, let's go with best practices. Best practices are that you clean up your trash, you don't leave things in orbit. The most important thing we can do about space debris is not make any more, and the best way to do that is that when you're done with your mission, get your stuff out of orbit. It's best if you get it out in a controlled fashion, because if it's uncontrolled, you've got this random risk that it may get someone, and we usually have standards of like 1 in 10,000 chance, but it's for a random reentry. It's far better to know exactly where you're going to put it, but that takes a controlled vehicle and a deliberate action. Another way to do it is to what we call design for demise, make certain that the spacecraft will come apart and not have very much harmful material survive, which is what most of the lightweight satellite operators are intending to do. The best way for industry to deal with this is to create a set of best practices with a strict eye toward minimizing space debris or the risk of the debris that re-enters. When we start launching at the pace we expect in the next 10 years, re-entries are going to go to 2, 3, 4 a day that people will see. If you imagine that I have a 4,000 satellite constellation and it has a 5-year lifetime, that means I'm replacing 800 satellites a year, which means 800 of them are coming in. That's more than 2 a day just for that constellation right there. So reentries are going to be more common. If we're not careful, and you start adding up the fleet risk of these small probability events, when you start multiplying times a lot of events, you start to see numbers that are undesirable. So being very careful about designing the systems to reenter safely, and primarily to get your trash out of orbit. Most of these large companies have great incentive to clean up after themselves because they're the ones who are using those orbits, and they don't want their dead satellites in their orbit.
And thankfully, this spacecraft doesn't have any nuclear fuel on it, which has been a concern, obviously, in the past. So where are you going to be at the estimated hour? Are you going to be huddled in front of a computer screen? Where are you going to be for the big letdown, or the crash, however you want to put it?
We were just working out on a drive here today, who's going to take what shift on this weekend when we expect it to come in. And so I'll either be in the office or nearby a phone, depending on exactly what time all this is going to happen. But if it were going to be predicted if somehow we're going to happen right over my head, the risk is such that I'd run outside with a camera. I'd really like to watch this.
So would I, and although I don't think I'm agile enough to be able to dodge something really big if it survives. Sir, thanks very much. We really appreciate it, and I hope everything goes as benignly as we hope it will.
Thank you much.